Ashley and Daniel Summers had always been described as the kind of couple people admired. From the moment they met during their junior year at a university in North Carolina, everything about their relationship seemed easy. Ashley wore a satin dress with delicate lace detailing, and Daniel couldn't stop smiling the entire day. She had always wanted to go somewhere tropical, where the days were slow and the water so clear you could see your toes beneath it. After weeks of searching for the perfect place, she found a private villa on the island of St. Lucian Bay, tucked in a lesser-known part of the Caribbean. Daniel, who wasn't much of a swimmer, agreed just to make Ashley happy. They took dozens of photos, goofy selfies, palm trees, and plates of grilled seafood. He told her not to worry. They were in paradise after all. The resort manager, an older woman with a strange, stiff smile, had briefly mentioned power outages being common but assured them everything would be fine. Once, during their second evening, the lights had flickered off for a few minutes while they were watching a movie. Daniel chalked it up to the island's unstable grid. That wasn't entirely strange, as most guests enjoyed sleeping in or lounging indoors. But when the next day passed with no sign of them, concern began to spread. Ashley's parents were the first to be contacted, followed by Daniel's. There was no sign of forced entry. No blood, no broken windows, only the unsettling emptiness of a space that felt recently abandoned. Both families were shocked. Ashley's sister, who had been in touch with her daily, broke down crying. She had texted Ashley the day before and never received a response. That had never happened before. The cleaning lady entered the villa and immediately sensed something was wrong. Ashley's phone was still charging next to the bed, her makeup bag was left open on the bathroom counter, and Daniel's sneakers were neatly lined up by the patio door. Their luggage was missing, but their passports were left behind in the safe, untouched. But by that evening the music was still playing, and the lights inside were on, though no one answered when housekeeping knocked. That night they stayed in, eating fruit and chocolate under a mosquito net while listening to the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. He was tall, lean, wearing a loose white shirt and carrying an old-fashioned camera. The hashtag Find Ashley and Daniel began trending, and journalists arrived to cover the case. What was supposed to be a fairy tale honeymoon had turned into a nightmare. He introduced himself as a photographer who worked with the island's tourism board. It was as if Ashley and Daniel had simply vanished from paradise, leaving behind only questions. He offered to take photos of them at a nearby cliff for a small fee. Pictures, he said, they could cherish forever. Ashley seemed intrigued, but Daniel politely declined. Still, the man handed them a flyer in case they changed their minds. It was marketed as a quiet coastal town, ideal for newlyweds seeking peace and privacy. The villa had an ocean-facing balcony, an outdoor shower, and a hammock stretched between two palm trees. Daniel was skeptical about the price at first, but Ashley convinced him that some memories were worth the splurge. Friends from college toasted their love. Family members cried during the vows. The streets were mostly quiet, lined with shops selling handmade jewelry and paintings. A few tourists passed by, but overall it was peaceful. They shared grilled lobster and rice, then took a long walk back along the beach under the moonlight. Ashley clutched Daniel's hand tightly. Everything felt like a dream. Everyone agreed it was one of the happiest weddings they'd ever attended. It was the last thing she ever posted. They had the same sense of humor, the same love for road trips, hiking, and quiet nights watching true crime documentaries. Ashley, a compassionate and disciplined nurse, had been saving up for their future long before Daniel proposed. Daniel, a financial analyst who kept spreadsheets for everything, including their wedding budget, was steady, devoted, and quietly ambitious. Together, they were the picture of balance. Their wedding had taken place on a warm spring afternoon in Charleston, in a historic garden venue lined with magnolia trees. The ceremony was simple, heartfelt, and elegant. The honeymoon, though, was what Ashley had truly been dreaming of. They arrived 2 days after the wedding, greeted by warm air and the scent of salt and sunscreen. The locals were friendly, the beaches uncrowded, and the villa even more beautiful than the photos. Ashley posted several stories on Instagram during their first evening there. One showed Daniel sipping a tropical drink on the deck, the sun setting behind him in a brilliant mix of orange and pink. Another showed her bare feet in the sand, captioned "Never leaving." On the second day, they explored the nearby town, bought fresh coconuts from a roadside stand, and booked a snorkeling trip for later in the week. It was all so idyllic that neither of them noticed the small inconsistencies. Their villa's front door had a lock, but Ashley had mentioned to Daniel that it sometimes didn't latch properly. On the third day, a man approached them near the shoreline. That night, they went out for dinner in the town. Back at the villa, Ashley uploaded a photo of their dinner with the caption, "Best night of my life." The next morning, their neighbor, an older Canadian couple staying in the next villa, overheard faint music playing from Ashley and Daniel's unit but never saw them come outside. At first, the staff assumed the couple had gone for a night out. The manager contacted the local police, who started a formal missing persons report. Search efforts began immediately. The police combed the nearby beaches, checked local CCTV, and questioned other guests at the resort. No one had seen them leave. Within days, news of the missing American couple spread across social media. Friends began posting tributes. Despite the growing attention, no real leads emerged. There were no ransom demands, no signs of a struggle, and no witnesses who had seen them leave the villa. And far beneath the surface of the perfect island life, something darker was beginning to stir. The first 48 hours after Ashley and Daniel's disappearance were filled with confusion, disbelief, and escalating dread. The staff at the resort, though initially calm, grew visibly nervous. Her mother looked like she hadn't slept in days, eyes red, hands shaking. Daniel's father arrived a day later, grim and silent. The families met for the first time not over a holiday meal or at a wedding. With the world watching, they were now forced to act with greater urgency. The lead investigator, a stern man named Inspector Ramir, ordered a re-examination of all previous tourist disappearances on the island. He also requested access to security footage from the resort, but quickly discovered there was a gap in the recordings. The cameras near Ashley and Daniel's villa had been malfunctioning. No footage was available from the night they went missing. But standing side by side in a police station, desperately hoping for any sign of their children. They dusted for fingerprints, collected items for DNA, and reviewed digital evidence. He lived in a neighboring village and had been out at sea on the morning following Ashley and Daniel's disappearance. While pulling in his nets, he claimed he saw something unusual near the cliffs, a piece of fabric caught on the rocks, fluttering in the breeze. Her skin was pale and waterlogged, but the bruises on her arms and deep stab wounds to her abdomen told a clear story. There were no signs she had fallen. She had been placed there deliberately. Tourists left in waves, some canceling their bookings out of fear. A few believed the island was hiding something much darker, and someone on that island had planned it carefully, executing the crime without leaving a single trace except for that flyer. The government issued a formal apology to the families, but it did little to ease their pain. Ashley's sister refused to return home until she had answers. Daniel's father hired a private investigator to work alongside local law enforcement. Her wedding ring was missing. Nearby, investigators found faint drag marks in the sand, leading from the top of the cliffs down toward the edge. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming it was trash or lost clothing. But after hearing the news, he went back to check. What he found was a torn white dress, partially shredded, but unmistakably bridal in style. It was wedged between jagged stones near the base of a cliffside trail. The area wasn't easily accessible. It took rescue teams nearly 3 hours to reach it. Ashley's laptop showed her browsing travel blogs and booking a couple's massage. Daniel's emails revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Their final transactions included dinner receipts, bottled water from a nearby convenience store, and a cash withdrawal that matched the cost of an excursion. Ashley's parents held a press conference, begging for help, their voices cracking under the weight of grief. His skull was fractured, his wrists bound behind his back with thin rope. Unlike Ashley, he had not been stabbed. Instead, it appeared he had been struck violently and pushed into the rocks. The couple had died within hours of each other, likely on the same night they vanished. Their dream honeymoon had ended in brutal murder. Daniel's mother wept on live television, holding up a photo from the wedding. News channels replayed the footage repeatedly, splicing it with clips of the tropical island, the empty villa, and the quiet, eerie beauty of the sea. Police began arriving at the villa with increasing frequency, marking off sections of the beach with yellow tape and questioning every employee who had worked that week. The ad had no official logo, just a name Peter and a phone number scribbled at the bottom. Investigators called the number, but it was disconnected. The handwriting on the flyer didn't match either Ashley's or Daniel's. It was carefully written, almost too neat. The staff claimed to have never heard of Peter, though one housekeeper vaguely remembered someone matching the description handing out flyers on the beach. Tourists were asked for photos, videos, or any information they might have that could help. Some guests said they had seen Ashley and Daniel walking hand in hand along the shore. Others claimed to have seen them dining at a small beach cafe. But no one could pinpoint exactly when the couple had last been seen together. Ashley's parents flew in from the U.S. almost immediately. By then, the couple had been missing for nearly 4 days. The search had expanded beyond the resort. Local volunteers, fishermen, and even vacationers joined in, but some international outlets began to dig deeper, uncovering a troubling pattern. This wasn't the first time tourists had gone missing on or near St. Lucian Bay. In the past 10 years, at least 3 similar cases had been quietly closed or marked unsolved. A couple from Germany had vanished while hiking. A solo traveler from Australia had never checked out of her villa. A honeymooning pair from Canada had drowned, though their bodies were never recovered. Each case had received minimal coverage and had been quickly forgotten. Drones scanned the coastline. Divers explored underwater caves near the cliffs. Police officers trudged through the dense tropical vegetation surrounding the villas. But despite the growing search effort, nothing conclusive was found. The local media began reporting on the case, framing it as a tragic mystery that disrupted the peace of an otherwise quiet island. The sudden media pressure brought unwanted attention to the local authorities. Meanwhile, forensic investigators continued to analyze the couple's living space. But the most troubling discovery was a flyer found inside a book on the nightstand. It was from a man offering private photography sessions for honeymooners. The flyer became the first real lead in the investigation. As the search stretched into its 6th day, frustration turned into hopelessness. And then something changed. A fisherman named Matteo came forward with information. When they arrived, they found more than just fabric. Ashley's body was discovered first, hidden in a narrow crevice where the waves occasionally splashed over the rocks. Later that day, Daniel's body was recovered floating in a shallow tide pool. The island was thrown into shock. Locals laid flowers near the cliffs. Back in the U.S., their death sparked outrage. Social media erupted with theories and accusations. Some blamed the resort. Others suggested a cover-up. But one thing was clear: Ashley and Daniel had not been victims of chance. They had been targeted. The mystery of the smiling couple who had walked into paradise and never come back was no longer a missing persons case. It was now a murder investigation. With Ashley and Daniel's bodies found and confirmed, the case shifted rapidly. What began as a missing persons search turned into an international homicide investigation. The autopsies revealed the brutality of their final moments. Ashley had been stabbed 7 times in the torso, while Daniel had suffered severe head trauma and ligature marks on his wrists. The violence was deliberate, personal, and controlled. These weren't impulsive attacks by a panicked thief. This was methodical, planned. Public outrage intensified. People wanted answers, especially as reports surfaced about similar past disappearances that had been conveniently brushed aside. A name eventually surfaced: Peter Langston. He had rented a small beach bungalow a few miles from the main resort, paid in cash. Drawers had been yanked open and clothes were missing. But not everything had been cleared. In the corner of the bedroom was a large duffel bag left behind. There were photos of people tied up, some blindfolded, some crying. One couple appeared unconscious on a rocky beach, their faces bruised and limbs limp. Then came the unsettling shift. The next image was blurry, as if the camera had been dropped or swung mid-motion. A task force formed to track down the suspect, whose real name had yet to be confirmed. Fingerprints lifted from the duffel bag matched a man named Stephen Harland, a Canadian fugitive who had disappeared nearly a decade earlier. On another memory card, investigators found coordinates scribbled on a digital notepad file. When the location was tracked, it pointed to a remote part of the island far from the resorts and villas. A search team was dispatched immediately. The terrain was dense and overgrown, the kind of place few tourists would wander into. After hours of clearing brush, they found it. He was wanted in connection with 2 assaults in British Columbia and a missing persons case involving a backpacker who vanished in Belize. He had evaded capture for years by forging identities, using cash, and exploiting islands with weak enforcement and high tourist traffic. The following series revealed the horror. Daniel tied up, a cut across his lip. Forensic teams continued analyzing the recovered photos, hoping for clues. Their love story had started with such hope and promise, only to be ended by something senseless and evil. Their deaths became a symbol, not just of personal tragedy, but of how danger can hide in the most beautiful places. Their case forced a global conversation about tourist safety, unchecked crime, and how often silence hides something unspeakable. Experts studied his patterns, trying to predict where he might strike next, but it was like chasing a ghost. He had planned each move so precisely that investigators were always catching up after the fact. Items found near them, a wedding band, a pair of sunglasses, a camera lens, helped identify a few of the victims. They were all couples, all tourists, all presumed lost or drowned in unrelated incidents over the years. In reality, they had all been murdered. The island had unknowingly harbored a serial killer, and Ashley and Daniel had been his final known victims, at least for now. Ashley lying on her side, her hands outstretched. The photos stopped there, but it was enough. Families of other victims came forward, reigniting cold cases long forgotten. The island, once a symbol of relaxation, became associated with horror. Enough to confirm what investigators had feared: this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was the work of a calculated predator. None of these images had ever been shared publicly. Some of the victims were unknown. Others were matched to previously closed missing persons cases. Police now believed the man behind the lens had been operating for years, moving from island to island, changing identities, preying on couples who fit a very specific pattern. Inside were old passports, hotel keycards, disposable cameras, and 2 different driver's licenses, both with different names. There were also memory cards, one of them still in a camera, and checked in 2 weeks before Ashley and Daniel's arrival. The address was quickly raided. The island, once seen as a romantic retreat, was now under a harsh spotlight. Government officials scrambled to maintain the tourism industry while simultaneously trying to assure the world that justice would be served. But behind the scenes, law enforcement was struggling. There were no witnesses, no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry into the villa. The only lead remained the mysterious photographer known as Peter. The flyer, now carefully preserved as evidence, became the focal point. Investigators scanned nearby hotels and resorts to see if the same flyer had been handed to others. After days of asking around, they got a break. A newlywed couple from Michigan remembered receiving a similar flyer a few days before Ashley and Daniel went missing. They had considered booking a session, but decided against it at the last minute. The man who approached them had a camera slung over his shoulder and wore a woven bracelet on his right wrist. He spoke softly, carried a small photo album, and insisted on sunrise shoots at the cliffs. The Michigan couple provided a description that matched what was slowly becoming a profile. A man in his late 30s or early 40s, light brown hair, lean build, possibly with an American or Canadian accent. He introduced himself casually and never seemed pushy. It was his calm demeanor that made him forgettable, blending in with the friendly tourist crowd. As police widened their net, they began digging into immigration records, resort guest lists, rental agreements, anything that might reveal a man named Peter, or anyone matching the description, arriving on the island within the last month. Inside the bungalow, authorities found signs that someone had left in a hurry. A coffee mug sat half-finished on the table. The files on the card were deeply disturbing. What began as scenic portraits of honeymooning couples quickly turned dark. Ashley and Daniel's last moments had also been captured. Photos showed them smiling at the cliffs, the ocean behind them. Interpol was alerted. Harland, it seemed, was always one step ahead. As law enforcement raced to locate him, a second discovery shocked everyone involved in the case: a shallow grave. And then another. In total, 6 burial sites were uncovered. Some bodies were more recent, others skeletal. The story exploded globally. News outlets broadcasted the discoveries with grim urgency. The media began referring to Harland as the Honeymoon killer. But despite the new evidence, Harland remained missing. The fear was that he had already moved on to another island, another identity, another set of targets. Back home, Ashley and Daniel's families held a joint memorial. And still, somewhere out there, the man who ended it all was free. The pressure to catch Stephen Harland reached a boiling point. His name and face were now known around the world. News channels flashed his image across screens, and his chilling nickname, the Honeymoon Killer, trended on every platform. Yet despite the global manhunt, he remained hidden. The island of St. Lucian Bay became a crime scene in itself. When investigators traced its movements through surveillance footage, they discovered it had crossed the island and was abandoned near the edge of a coastal forest preserve. A tracking team was dispatched. Footprints and discarded food wrappers were found, indicating someone had been living off the grid. Then, half a mile into the woods, they discovered a crude camp. The location was another island, El Carmino, off the coast of Central America. A honeymoon couple from Spain had vanished there under mysterious circumstances. Their bodies had never been found, and local police had ruled it a case of accidental drowning. But the images on the card proved otherwise. They showed the couple tied together with wire, their expressions frozen in terror, moments before their final breaths. He had changed his appearance now with dyed black hair and thick glasses, but the vendor recognized the woven bracelet on his wrist. Authorities surrounded the area and apprehended him near an abandoned dock. He offered no resistance. In fact, he didn't say a single word. He simply smiled as they placed him in handcuffs. It was undeniable. Harland had been operating undetected for far longer than anyone realized, crossing borders and blending into vacation crowds. There was a sense of relief, but also unease. What if he had accomplices? What if there were still victims left to find? Tourists visited the cliffs where Ashley's body had been found, leaving flowers and photos in remembrance. He continued to write notes in his cell, sometimes sketching scenes from his crimes, as if he were composing one final piece of his twisted legacy. Their story was turned into books, documentaries, and investigative reports that criticized not just the killer, but the systems that had failed to notice him. They had come to paradise to start their lives. Instead, they had unearthed a nightmare that the world could no longer ignore. In the first official interrogation, Harland remained calm, refusing to answer most questions. He drew maps, marked burial spots, and identified personal belongings left behind. But he never expressed regret. To him, it was all part of a grand design. He claimed the island chose who would be sacrificed, that his victims were part of a larger narrative he had constructed over the years. His tone was cold, measured, and without emotion. It became clear that this was not just a killer. They were dealing with someone who believed in his own mythology. But then he asked for a specific Detective Inspector Ramir, the man leading the case from the beginning. When Ramir entered the room, Harland finally spoke. There was a tarp tied between trees, a pile of ashes from a fire pit, and a backpack filled with water bottles, granola bars, and a hunting knife. He targeted honeymooners, specifically white couples in their 20s or 30s, often those staying in private villas or off-the-grid resorts. He operated with precision and left little behind. He didn't kill out of rage or impulse. It was calculated, ritualistic. More cases were reopened across the Caribbean and Central America, linked by similar patterns. Though many questions were answered, the damage had already been done. Ashley and Daniel's deaths had become the catalyst that exposed years of overlooked tragedies. On one of the newer memory cards was a scanned ferry ticket dated only days before the discovery of the forest camp. The ferry led to a neighboring island called Isla Rojo, smaller and even less populated than St. Lucian Bay. It wasn't known for tourism, but for fishing and farming. Authorities immediately launched a search operation there, deploying boats, helicopters, and plainclothes officers to blend in with the community. Experts believed he saw himself as an artist, capturing his victims not just in photographs but in the planning, the control, and the aftermath. He was obsessed with the idea of beauty turning into horror, love being shattered. That made him more dangerous than most. He didn't want money. He didn't want chaos. He wanted control. He introduced himself as a photographer, gained their trust, and then isolated them. His method of killing varied, sometimes stabbing, sometimes blunt force, sometimes drowning. But the psychological manipulation remained constant. He made the couples feel safe before turning the fantasy into a nightmare. Tourists fled in droves, booking last-minute flights to anywhere else. Businesses suffered. Local officials were bombarded with questions about how a serial predator had operated under their noses for years, but in the midst of the chaos, a new lead emerged. A local gas station owner named Luis came forward claiming he had seen Harland, although he didn't know the man's real name at the time, just 2 days after Ashley and Daniel's disappearance had been confirmed. Luis remembered him well, because the man had asked unusual questions about the shipping docks and ferry times. He bought a cheap, oversized sun hat, several canned goods, and prepaid phone cards. Inside the backpack was a small metal case, and within it, labeled carefully with dates and names, were 4 more memory cards. The horror continued. More images. More couples. A sickening timeline that stretched back years. Harland had documented nearly everything his victims, their belongings, and in some cases the exact spots where he had buried them. The photos weren't just trophies. They were a methodical record of his crimes. Luis had written down the license plate of the vehicle Harland drove, a habit he kept for all unfamiliar customers. That detail would prove critical. The vehicle, a small green pickup truck, had been reported stolen from another village. There were also more memory cards. The team froze as they realized what they had stumbled upon. One card contained an entry that stood out from the rest. The date was 2 years prior. The pattern became disturbingly clear. He chose remote islands with small populations and inconsistent police infrastructure. Investigators brought in behavioral analysts from the FBI and Interpol. A full profile was built. Harland was intelligent, detail-oriented, and socially adept. As investigators sorted through the evidence, they found a startling clue. 3 days later, in a small village on the north side of Isla Rojo, a man matching Harland's description was spotted by a market vendor. Back on St. Lucian Bay, news of Harland's capture spread like wildfire. He said he had more to show. What followed was a series of shocking confessions. Harland detailed the planning behind each murder. Authorities recovered 2 more bodies from graves Harland described, bringing the confirmed count to 11. In the aftermath, memorials were held not only for them but for all the victims Harland had taken. Harland remained in custody, awaiting trial on multiple counts of murder. And though he was finally captured, the image of Ashley and Daniel, their smiles on that cliff, their joy before it turned to horror, never faded from the public's memory. Stephen Harland's trial became one of the most watched court cases in modern history. Held in a secure federal courtroom on U.S. territory after a coordinated extradition, the proceedings drew global attention. Ashley's mother carried a photo of her daughter every day, tucked into a leather-bound notebook. Daniel's father, stoic and silent, never missed a single minute of testimony. On the final day, the judge read aloud the guilty verdicts, every single one of them. Tourism plummeted. The resort where Ashley and Daniel stayed was permanently closed. Their villa, once advertised as a romantic escape, now stood abandoned, its doors boarded up. Locals stopped walking along the cliffs. The beach where the couple had last smiled for a photo became a memorial site. Visitors left flowers, candles, and seashells inscribed with messages of remembrance. Some believed he saw himself as an artist, crafting a narrative through terror and control. Some entries were just sketches, boats, cliffs, cameras. Others were disjointed thoughts about power, beauty, and silence. Locals and travelers joined them, lighting candles and releasing floating lanterns into the ocean. Their story, though painful, brought people together. In remembering them, others stayed safe. In honoring their lives, the world remained vigilant. Authorities debated whether to release his writings, ultimately choosing not to. A reminder that even in the most beautiful places, darkness can wait just beyond the frame. They didn't want to give him the attention he clearly still craved. Others thought he was simply opportunistic, using charm and misdirection to mask a deep emptiness inside. People remembered Ashley and Daniel not just for how they died, but for who they were before the nightmare. Two kind, hopeful people starting a life together, eager to explore the world. They weren't reckless. They didn't make bad choices. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, targeted by someone who saw their love as an opportunity for control. But none of it truly explained why someone would seek out love stories only to end them in blood. His motives remained as mysterious as his blank expression during sentencing. The sentence was life without the possibility of parole, plus additional time for each count of aggravated murder. As the gavel fell, Harlan blinked once and smiled faintly as if he had just finished a long performance. But for everyone else in that room, it was not closure. It was a reminder that justice, while served, could never undo the suffering. When forensic experts described the couple's final moments, the courtroom fell silent. The details were harrowing. Ashley likely remained conscious during most of her attack. News specials aired interviews with travel safety experts. Governments released new advisories for couples vacationing in isolated areas. Ashley's sister, Megan, worked closely with a filmmaker to create a series focused on telling the victims' stories, not just the crimes. The foundation's work expanded quickly, connecting with embassies, travel blogs, and international safety coalitions. What started as grief became purpose. She spoke at universities, police conferences, and travel expos, urging people to look past glossy brochures and to ask hard questions about safety. She became the voice of a movement she never wanted to lead. Laws were introduced in several countries requiring better background checks for resort staff and independent contractors operating near tourists. Though the actions came too late for many, they helped prevent future tragedies. Daniel may have been forced to watch her die before he was killed. The brutality was matched only by the cold precision with which Harlan carried out his plan. Every seat in the gallery was filled with journalists, families of victims, and observers eager to see justice unfold. The prosecution had assembled a mountain of evidence, photographic records, buried remains, GPS data, victim identification, and Harlan's own confessions. The defense barely stood a chance. From the moment the charges were read 11 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and multiple counts of fraud and identity theft, there was no doubt about the outcome. But even with his fate almost sealed, Harlan remained emotionless. He sat still, hands folded, expression blank. Not once did he look at the photos of the victims projected on the courtroom screen. Ashley and Daniel's families attended every session, sitting quietly behind the prosecution bench. Throughout the trial, more victims were uncovered. As forensic teams revisited islands from Harlan's travels, aided by the maps and files he provided, 5 additional graves were found. Couples who had vanished without explanation, written off as accidents or assumed lost at sea, were finally identified. Some families had long given up hope. Now, with confirmation, they faced the terrible truth that their children, siblings, or friends had fallen prey to the same calculated predator. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The island of St. Lucian Bay never recovered its reputation. Ashley and Daniel's story became the centerpiece of a global conversation on tourist safety, law enforcement negligence, and the hidden dangers lurking in places marketed as paradise. Documentaries were produced, each detailing the steps of the investigation, the psychological profile of the killer, and the lives of the victims. Daniel's father launched a foundation in his son's name, offering travel grants for young couples while also providing resources about how to stay safe when traveling abroad. Even with Harlan behind bars, people remained fascinated by how he had evaded capture for so long. Criminal psychologists published papers analyzing his behavior. Harlan never appealed his conviction. He remained in solitary confinement, writing in notebooks that were confiscated periodically by prison staff. Years passed, but the story endured. It became a modern cautionary tale, one that resurfaced every time a couple went missing abroad. Every July, on the anniversary of their deaths, their families visited the memorial at the cliffs. In the end, Ashley and Daniel became more than victims. They became a legacy, a reason for change.